Okay, good morning, folks. I'm going to go ahead and call to order this meeting of the Shad and River Herring Management Board. So good morning, all. My name is Justin Davis. I'm the Administrative Commissioner from Connecticut, and I'm currently serving as the Chair of the Shad and River Herring Management Board. I'll acknowledge up here at the head table with me, I have Dr. Katie Drew and James Boyle from Commission staff, as well as Brian Nealon from New Jersey DEP, our current Technical Committee Chair, all of whom will be helping out with running the meeting today. So for our first order of business this morning is approval of the agenda. I'll ask if anybody has any suggested modifications or additions to the agenda that was provided in the meeting materials. Okay, not seeing any hands, we'll consider the agenda approved by consent. Moving on to the next item, approval of the proceedings from the last meeting of this board in May of this year, which were also provided in the meeting materials. I'll also take a quick minute to thank my vice chair, Lynn Fegley from the state of Maryland, for running that meeting because I was not available. Thanks, Lynn. Any suggested edits, modifications, additions to the meeting proceedings from May 2022? Okay, not seeing any hands. We'll consider those proceedings approved by consent. Moving right along here. Next item on the agenda is public comment. This would be public comment for any items not on the meeting agenda this morning. Do we have any members of the public here in the room or on the webinar who would like to provide public comment at this time? Okay, not seeing anybody who'd like to make public comment at this time. So we'll move along here to our next item on the agenda. We're going to have a series of presentations this morning concerning shad habitat plans and sustainable fishery management plans. For the first of those, I'm going to turn to Brian Nealon for a presentation on an American shad habitat plan update. Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to the board. My name is Brian Nealon, and I'm the TC rep from New Jersey and current chair of the Shad and River Herring TC. I hope you've been enjoying, your time in my home state so far. I heard the bunker put on a show for you yesterday. Today I have for you a few different plans for your consideration. First is an American shad habitat plan for the Taunton River in Massachusetts, followed by a few river herring sustainable fishery management plans, all out of New England. Oh, sure. So we can go next slide. So just some quick background on these habitat plans. Under Amendment 3 to the Shad and River Herring Fishery Management Plan, all states and jurisdictions are required to submit habitat plans for American shad. These plans are meant to contain a summary of current information, current and historical information on spawning and nursery habitat, any threats to those habitats, and any habitat restoration programs or anything going on within each state. Back in February of 2022, the board agreed that these plans should be updated every 5 years or so, similar to how we update our sustainable fishery management plans. So over the past couple of years, the board's been presented with a slew of updated and new plans for consideration from various agencies and jurisdictions as the board requested. Next slide. So at the end of last month, one habitat plan was evaluated by the TC and has been submitted for board consideration today. This is the Taunton River Plan out of Massachusetts. The TC recommends approval of this plan. You can go next slide. So we'll jump right in here. The Taunton River Plan was submitted by the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries and was presented by the Mass TC rep Brad Chase. Next slide. So each plan is required to have a habitat assessment that details current and historic shad spawning and nursery habitat. For the Taunton River, for this particular plan, the Taunton River is one of the largest rivers in southeast Massachusetts. It's unique in New England being such a large river with no dams or impediments along the course of its main stem. There was historical commercial shad fisheries in the main stem and tributaries that were impacted by overharvest, dams in the tributaries, and industrial pollution. There's been minimal recent evidence of existing shad run, despite some stocking efforts that went on in the 60s and 70s. Before those stocking efforts, the Mass DMF did a survey to assess the habitat and found 45 kilometers of the main stem of potential spawning habitat. So this plan was primarily developed to support the development of a shad stocking effort in the Taunton River. It's a multi-agency effort between Mass DMF, Massachusetts Division of Wildlife, and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. With recent improvements in water management and decreases in pollution, they're hoping that they might be a little more successful in this stocking effort. Next slide. So each plan is required to do a threats assessment. So this is kind of a plan in progress, but Mass DMF wanted to submit the plan in order to highlight the current and future stocking efforts that they're undertaking. And as I said, they're hoping to take advantage of the nearly 80 acres of potential spawning and nursery habitat. At this time, no formal threats assessment has been conducted, but barriers to migration, which is one of the greatest threats to spawning habitat access, is not an issue, at least in the main stem here. The biggest issues in the past were commercial overfishing and industrial pollution, which degraded the water quality and spawning habitat to the point that shad spawning was largely unsuccessful. Next slide. So habitat plans are also required to detail any habitat restorations programs going on within the watershed or the state. As mentioned before, this is a kind of an in-the-works plan that is being developed to support the joint agency stocking effort. So for the Mass DMF expects that a habitat survey and assessment would be useful for this watershed, with methods potentially transferable to other watersheds within Massachusetts, but they're still working on funding, which is, I know we've all experienced problems with. And Mass DMF recommended that the following actions be taken for the Taunton River. First, an assessment of the amount and suitability of habitat for shad spawning and rearing. They have the assessment from the 60s, but they'd obviously like to update that with the water quality increases over the past decades. And then continued monitoring to document the status of the shad spawning run in response to the stocking efforts. So next slide. Within the habitat plan, Mass DMF also included the proposed stocking plan for the Taunton River. So the Taunton River watershed has about 80 acres of potential American shad spawning habitat. Based on this estimate, Mass DMF and the other agencies involved are looking to do stock over the next 4 to 5 years, about 20 million shad larvae. To achieve this goal, they're going to be taking 350 broodstock fish from Holyoke Dam yearly, doing strip spawning, and then surviving adults will be released post spawning. Additionally, they're going to be doing monitoring for juveniles during the summer and fall to look at success rates of their stocking. Adult monitoring would begin 3 years after the initial stocking. 3 years is when you start seeing your returns. So far in 2022, over 5 million shad larvae were stocked, and during summer sampling, they found juvenile American shad at three of the 5 monitoring stations they currently monitor. So that's the rundown of the Taunton River plan from Massachusetts. I could take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for that presentation. I'll turn back to the board and see if there are any questions for Brian. Okay, not seeing any hands from the board. I think at this point, James, will need a motion to approve the shad habitat plan update. So I'm wondering if there might be a member of the board who'd be willing to make that motion. Mike Armstrong.
Certainly. I move to approve the updated Shad habitat plan for Massachusetts as presented today.
Okay, we have a motion from Mike Armstrong. I'm just going to wait till it's up on the board. There it is. I'm looking for a second. Eric Reed, Rhode Island. I'll ask the board if there's any discussion on the motion. Mike is the maker of the motion. Do you want to provide any rationale?
Yeah, I don't think I need to say much. It was covered in the presentation there, but we're pretty excited to begin a cooperative program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hatchery in North Attleboro, which is adjacent to the Taunton River. And we've already had some documentation of success. The Taunton is a big river. And my only question is, why haven't we done this before? But the stars have aligned, and I think it'll be awesome.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Any other members of the board wish to make a comment on the motion? Okay, we'll see if we can do this the easy way. Are there any objections to the motion? Okay, not seeing any hands. The motion passes by unanimous consent. All right, so we're going to go back to Brian here for our next presentation on approval of 2 sustainable fishery management plan updates. Brian.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Wait on the slide. Alrighty, so next I'll be going over some river herring sustainable fishery management plans from Massachusetts and Maine. Next slide. Just a bit of background on our sustainable fishery management plans and what is required of them, including the FFP's sustainability definition. So amendments 2 and 3 of the Shad and River Herring Plan require states wishing to have a fishery to submit a sustainable fishery management plan. The definition of sustainability in the FMP is that any harvest will demonstrate their stock can support a commercial and/or recreational fishery that will not diminish the future stock reproduction and recruitment. These plans are updated and reviewed every 5 years to reassess stock status and the sustainability of the harvest. So last month, the TC reviewed a bunch of plans, updates and new plans from Massachusetts and Maine. 3 herring sustainable fishery management plans were evaluated by the TC and are being submitted today for the board's consideration. We have a Nemasket River update to their current SFMP, a Herring River out of Massachusetts new plan being added to this Massachusetts state plan, and then an update to the addendum to the Maine 2019 Sustainable Fishery Management Plan. Again, these are all river herring plans. The TC recommends approval of both Massachusetts plans and the continuation of the Maine limited fisheries based on the presented update. So the first presentation was a regularly scheduled update of the Nemasket River Herring Sustainable Management Plan from Massachusetts. The proposed Nemasket River fishery is a small dip net fishery with harvest that would predominantly be used for bait and personal consumption. It's cooperative management managed by the Massachusetts DMF and the Middleborough and Lakeville Town Herring Fishery Commission. The Fishery Commission is made up of residents of the town, and they kind of do the counts. They manage the fishery on the local level. The updated plan remains relatively unchanged from the previous iteration. Just a quick rundown of the management measures here. It's a 5-week season that goes middle of April to middle of May. Approximately 900 permits issued per year with required reporting, and the harvest allowance is 20 fish per permit per week with unique trip tickets for each trip. And to possess the river herring, you have to have these trip tickets in your possession as well. Might have buried the lead here a bit, but no harvest was permitted throughout the previous tenure of the plan. the Herring Commission did not permit harvest for a couple of reasons. The year before they were going to start harvest, there's a decrease in their run counts to a level that the commission was not comfortable with allowing harvest to take place. There's also some hesitancy there to be the only open fishery in the state, kind of worried about concentration of effort on their stretch there. So next slide. So here are the fishery program mechanics. The management unit is the Nemasket River between the run of the river between the towns of Middleborough and Lakeville. That's the only place where harvest would potentially be allowed if the Herring Commission wants to open a fishery. For sustainability measure, there's ongoing spawning run counts used to calculate run size, and that will serve as the primary measure to monitor the runs, the health of the runs. So they have a sustainability target. They plan to harvest will be capped at 10% of the time series mean of the run counts. This value will be recalculated each year. So their primary action threshold, their management threshold will be 25th percentile of the run count. So if this threshold is exceeded 2 years in a row, the harvest rate will be reduced in half to 5% of the time series mean. And if it's exceeded 3 years in a row, then the fishery will be closed until such time that 3 years in a row above the management target is achieved. But as I said previously, there's been no harvest so far. They also plan on using a secondary threshold to kind of reinforce the other threshold. So as I said, 10% of the time series mean is their harvest goal here. In any given year, if they exceed their 10% harvest rate, Mass DMF will meet with the Herring Commission to review the harvest records and look at their management practices to look at ways they could reduce harvest through different control measures, reducing permits, reducing fishing days, bag limits, that sort of thing. They're also looking at potential future targets, including mortality based on repeat spawning. So they're taking biological samples as well. So here's a graph showing the annual run count over the years with the blue line at the bottom. If you could see it representing the 10% harvest threshold. The red area represents the first quartile management threshold. So like I said, 2 years below that, the harvest target will be reduced in half, and 3 years below, the fishery will be closed. And then the top line there's the time series mean. So that's it for the Nemasket plan update. I guess I could take questions and just reiterate that although they had the ability to harvest, they've been the Herring Commission's been very cautious and conservative and hasn't harvested at all during the previous tenure.
Okay, thanks, Brian. At this point, I'll turn back to the board and see if there are any questions on the Nemasket River Plan update. Brian, I do have one quick question. Is the last year in that graph 2021 or 2022, the last year of data?
I believe that's 2021. I'm
Okay.
not sure if they've finished calculating 2022 yet.
Yeah, I believe this year's number is around 700, 800,000. It's not on the graph though.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, not seeing any hands from the board. I think, Brian, what we should do is maybe just move along to the next Massachusetts plan update, and then at the end of that, we could consider a motion to approve the 2 sustainable fishery management plan updates from Massachusetts.
Sure. So Massachusetts also submitted a proposed river herring SFMP for the Herring River. Next slide. So the proposed plan is essentially the same as the Nemasket River plan we just viewed, with some tweaks to kind of tailor it to this particular river's run. There's less total permits here, but they stayed at the 10% of the time series mean as their harvest target. I believe the town of Harwich, their herring commission also has similar hesitancy to open for similar reasons. In the Mascot plan, they're worried about being the only open fishery and the concentration of effort, and then they're also just being very, very cautious and conservative, given the state of river herring coastwide. Next slide. So again, here are the fishery program mechanics. As I said, very, very similar to the Manasket River, just tailored to the Herring Rivers run. The run size will be measured through combined visual, and on the Herring River, they have an electronic fish counter. Those run counts are currently combined, but in the future, I think once they get their electronic fish counts dialed in, I believe they're going to transition to fish counter only in the next iteration of the plan for the counts. Again, the sustainability target's 10% of the time series mean. The primary action threshold is the same at the 25th percentile of the run. They also have that secondary threshold looking at yearly harvest rates, and if they ever exceed that 10% on a given year, they'll revisit their harvest control measures. And for management actions, if in any given year run count falling below the 25th percentile will be reported, in the ASMSC's annual compliance report. 2 years in a row below the sustainability target of 25% will reduce the harvest in half, and then 3 years in a row will close down the fishery. All right, so I went through that one a little quicker just because it's very similar to the previous plan, so I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I'll turn back to the board and see if there are any questions relative to the Herring River Sustainable Fishery Management Plan. I do have one question or a comment, and I think I direct this to you, Mike, possibly. I suspect many folks around the table are aware, but if not, we just had one of the worst years on record for river herring returns in southern New England and Connecticut. Many of the runs we monitor, we sort of recorded the lowest returns we've ever recorded or close to. And, cursory examination of the data suggests that it doesn't look like a single year class failure, that sort of all the year classes in the runs were at much lower than expected abundances. So has the biologists on our staff who deal with river herring kind of scratching their heads about what's going on with river herring in southern New England. So there was a lot of allusion in the presentation to a conservative stance about harvest on these rivers. And I'm wondering, do you have any insight with, even if these plans being approved, whether you think Mass DMF and the town groups that are managing these rivers are going to move forward with opening harvest next year, or if there might be a little bit of a wait and see approach given the year we just had for river herring returns?
Yeah, I don't think they'll harvest. There were downturns in a lot of our runs too, but not all of them. It's more these are our two largest runs, and they historically have been harvested, and they want it in their back pocket to be available. And I honestly can't tell you if the Herring River, if we pass this, would even be above the threshold for harvest. But Brad Chase told me they're not terribly interested in aggressively going forward with harvesting until things are steady and looking good.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Looking to the board to see if there are any additional questions. Okay, so at this point, I think we'll need a motion to approve these two sustainable fishery management plans from Massachusetts. I'll look to the board to see if somebody's willing to make that motion. Sheree Patterson. Okay, Sheree, would you mind reading that motion into the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would love to move to approve the updated river herring sustainable fishery management plan from Massachusetts as presented today.
Hey, thank you, Sri. We have a motion on the board. Do we have a second? See Steve Train. I'll turn back to you, Sri, to see if you want to provide any rationale for the motion.
No, I think Brian covered the management plans very well, and I don't see any issues with them.
Okay, thank you. I'll look back to the board to see if there are any additional comments on the motion. All right, seeing no additional hands, I'll ask if there are any objections to the motion. All right, not seeing any hands, the motion passes by unanimous consent. Okay, Brian, I'll turn back to you for the presentation on the addendum to Maine Sustainable Fishery Management Plan.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wait for the motion to get completed. All set. So lastly, I have an update on the Maine River Herring Sustainable Fishery Management Plan addendum. Next slide. So in 2019, the board approved an addendum to the Maine River Herring SFMP to allow 3 provisional fisheries through 2024. This was in an effort to incentivize the continuation of local restoration efforts. There's been a lot of great local restoration efforts on these 3 rivers that were these provisional fisheries were allowed. Dam removals, culvert replacements, improvements to fish passage. So as kind of a to keep the momentum going, they opted to possibly allow a provisional fisheries in these rivers. So the board required an update to look at these provisional fisheries to see if they're having an effect, good or bad, on the river herring runs. So 3 habitats, there were 3 habitats in the addendum ranging from 43 to 135 acres of potential spawning habitat. These locations did not meet the existing Maine SFMP metrics, but as I said, were under restoration, so they didn't quite have run counts that met the minimum amount of years, but they were almost there and currently getting really good returns. And as I said, there's active restoration efforts underway to increase population size, age structure, and repeat spawning, as well as lower the mortality estimates on the river, various rivers. Next slide. So for these limited fisheries, the control rules and assessment criteria were developed as follows. So this is they took kind of an escapement fishery approach. The harvest will occur after May 18th to allow older river herring to escape the fishery. Municipalities that allow recreational fisheries must enumerate and subtract the recreational harvest from the currently allowed commercial catch. The goal is the release of a minimum spawning stock threshold of 235 fish per acre. Commercial fishery that does not meet this escapement threshold will close until the fishery achieves the escapement threshold again at some point. And there will be annual review of age data, mortality rates, repeat spawning rates derived from annual biological collection to assess the need to reduce harvest numbers or to suspend any fishery short of the 5-year period. So it's very well tracked, or potentially be tracked. So the board asked for an update midway through the tenure of these provisional fisheries. Only 1 municipality opted to conduct a fishery. So in 2020, the run was over before the harvest opened on May 18th, so they chose to harvest the runbacks. So this kind of resulted in a higher mortality rate on older fish. So the other two municipalities did not opt to conduct their fishery, but they did continue with biological data and fish counts. And then the addendum requires management action resulting in a, due to the 2022 harvest in the one municipality that did allow harvest, management action resulting in reduction in the 2023 harvest to meet the mortality and repeat spawning goals. Next slide. So Maine had some recommendations from their presentation. They recommended to allow municipalities within the plan to continue to fish for the remainder of the 5-year period, or at least have the option to fish. As I said, only one of the 3 municipalities chose to conduct a harvest. They want to maintain the existing control rules that manage harvest based on returns, biological data, and associated management actions. And at the end of the addendum period, which I believe is 2024, they'll make a final determination on these provisional fisheries regarding whether to continue to allow them and assess whether further restoration access helps municipalities meet the Maine and ASMFC sustainability metrics. So that's all I have for that one, the main addendum update, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Turn it back to the board to see if there are any questions. Lynn Fegley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a curiosity question, maybe for the state of Maine, about it looked to me, I think what I saw was that for the harvest, the recreational harvest happens after May 18th. But anything that they harvest would be subtracted from the commercial catch allowance. And I'm just kind of curious how that works, and if because the timing seems, it's just an interesting setup, sort of a on the fly allocation. I just wonder if that works well, if that's how that, I'm curious.
Pat, look to you, see if you'd like to answer the question.
Thanks for that question, Lynn. I think I don't know if it works well or not, quite honestly. I mean, the intent here is to try to ensure that we can control the overall harvest, but because it's all happening in a very isolated location, we can keep an eye on that, and the volunteers track it pretty well. So I think, you know, overall, because of the size of the system, it works. If this was a larger system where they could harvest in multiple locations, it probably wouldn't work at all.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Look to the board to see if there are any additional questions on the presentation. I was remiss in not doing this earlier. I'd meant to provide an opportunity for public comment on this general agenda item on sustainable fishery management plan. So I'll ask at this time if there's any member of the public in the audience or in the webinar who'd like to make a public comment.
Yes, on the webinar we have Andrew Hertzina. Andrew, you're self-muted now, so if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and make a comment. Thank you. Andrew, you're still muted on your end, so if you want to click the little red button so it turns green.
Okay, Andrew, we'll go ahead and move on, but if you drop a comment potentially on the webinar, we could possibly come back to you to provide comment later on. Okay, so not seeing any additional hands from the board. At this point, we'll need a motion to approve Maine's Sustainable Fishery Management Plan Addendum. I'll look to the board to see if anybody would be willing to make that motion. Pat Kelleher.
And before I make that motion, just for clarity of the record, based on Marilyn's question, that the municipality actually, in this case, chose not to allow for that recreational harvest this past year. So that controlled it even more. So, on this particular issue, I would move to approve the continuation of the provisional river herring fisheries as described in the addendum to the Maine River Herring SFMP for the remainder of the 5-year period ending in 2024, at which time the technical committee will use the established sustainability criteria to evaluate if the municipalities may continue to harvest under the SFMP.
Okay, thank you, Pat. We have a motion by Pat Kelleher. I see a second from Malcolm Rhodes. Pat, I'll turn back to you to see if you want to provide any additional comments or rationale on the motion.
I don't have anything else.
Okay. Would any other member of the board care to comment on the motion? So I'll go back to Andrew, member of the public on the webinar, for a second try here for public comment. Andrew, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm lost control of the interface there for a moment. I'm Andy Hursina from the Mystic River Watershed Association in Boston, where we are very proud of our program of monitoring our herring run, and it have documented a 2 to 3-fold increase thanks to a fish ladder installation in collaboration. We do the monitoring in collaboration with DMF, and really some of my concerns have been addressed, but we wanted to just submit a comment urging caution on reinstituting harvests on Nemasket and Herring rivers at a time when it's not clear from data that populations are robust enough to support sustainable harvest. A major concern we had is lack of sort of publicly available analysis of how vulnerable these populations are to changes due to climate change, especially to the expected increase in the incidence and severity of summer droughts. And in fact, we noted also that the Herring River run has shown declines in the past 4 successive years from over 1 million to 25% of that number in 2022. So those comments about caution were appreciated, but maybe more to the point, if part of the motivation for reinstituting harvests is to engage a variety of stakeholders in the larger conservation efforts, we believe there are other and better ways, and we've had great success in recruiting volunteers for in-person counts. We have 150 people a year going out and doing counts. We also have an education program in schools that reach thousands of kids, and we have a video monitoring program that engages 5,000 users a year. We've shared that technology with Townbrook in Plymouth and with South River in Marshfield. And so if part of the motivation is encouraging public awareness and engagement, we think that these programs and technologies allow ways that reach more people than the relatively few people engaged in harvest. So that was our comment, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and I'll apologize again for not providing you an opportunity to make that comment earlier when we were considering Massachusetts sustainable fishery management plans. So at this point, I'll turn back to the board to see if there are any additional hands for comment or discussion. Okay, seeing none, I'll ask if there are any objections to the motion. Okay, seeing none, the motion passes by unanimous consent. All right, so we'll move on to our next agenda item. I'm going to turn to Dr. Katie Drew to provide an update on the 2023 River Herring Benchmark Stock Assessment.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we'll just get a presentation up here pretty quickly, and thank you, Madeline. We are going to go over today a quick summary of the timeline and where we are on that, and then present for your approval the terms of reference for the stock assessment and the stock assessment subcommittee membership for your approval. Next slide. So this is the current timeline. We have clearly moved ahead without having these things approved yet. But mostly we've been in the preparation stages of gathering data from our various states and partner agencies, as well as we did a call for data via a press release and got several data sets from academic and other institutions to supplement what we have. So we plan to have the SAS and the TORs approved today here at this webinar / in-person meeting. And then our next sort of big meetings will be a methods workshop in February-ish of next year and an assessment workshop in April of next year, so that we can finalize the report, have the peer review in August, and present to you again in October of 2023 at our annual meeting, the final results of this assessment. Obviously, this is a large amount of work. These are essentially 2 stock assessments for 2 separate species with multiple stocks going on at the same time. And so there is the possibility that this timeline will need to be adjusted in order to complete our work, but this is what we are on track for now. And obviously we will be having consistent SAS webinars throughout this process, but we've just highlighted some of the major meetings and milestones for now. So next slide. So what we need from you is basically approval of the terms of reference. Next slide. So this is an external peer review. So that means that we usually do 2 sets of TORs, one for the stock assessment subcommittee to follow, and that's for how we want to conduct the assessment itself, what we want to focus on, our major areas of concern, and then a separate set of TORs for the peer review panel itself to follow, which is more focused on evaluating what the SAS has completed. So we'll start with the TORs for the SAS and the TC. Next slide. So TOR 1, define and justify stock structure. So obviously river herring are genetically distinct populations at the river level, but we would like to have some sort of biologically justified stock structure in between the river and the coast wide that's maybe a little more biologically justifiable than just state. So we're looking to recent genetic information to kind of develop a stock structure on the coast that will let us pull in data sets from multiple rivers and also maybe make some inferences about rivers within genetic stock regions that don't have available data. So obviously then it's important to define and justify that within the assessment. So next slide. The second TOR is to characterize the precision and accuracy of all of the data that we have, the fishery dependent stuff, the fishery independent stuff. This includes life history data like age and repeat spawner data, as well as sort of your non-traditional stock assessment data sets like entrangement, impingement, passage, etc., that are unique to river herring. And obviously, next slide, this comes with a lot of sub-bullets that are all included in the meeting materials. We don't need to read through all of this, but basically it's just focused on, making sure that we are providing adequate descriptions of the data sources, describe how we're calculating or standardizing our indices, and making sure that we have fully described and the uncertainty with all of these data sets. And then finally, justify the inclusion or the elimination of these data sets as we go through and kind of pick and choose from what's available to us. Next slide. So TOR 3 is estimate bycatch where and when possible. So this will include pulling data from obviously the Northeast Fisheries Science Center bycatch observer programs, but also potentially looking at state data sets or individual one-off studies to cover bycatch of river herring. Again, when and where possible. So next slide. Summarize data availability and trends by stock. So we want to make sure that there is a tremendous amount of data out there for river herring. And so we want to make sure that we are capturing all of that data in a understandable and comprehensive format. So discussing what is available and what is not available, as well as what are the overall trends from this data by stock. Next slide. And then if possible, go beyond that sort of trend analysis to develop models used to estimate population parameters like total mortality, biomass, and abundance, as well as biological reference points, and analyze that model performance. So you will note that if possible and where possible is doing a lot of work in these TORs. I think with the recognition that these are data poor species, as I said, we have a ton of data for them, but they are still, it's still not enough. And so we may not be able to do traditional methods for all of the stocks or all of the rivers, but we're going to give it a try. So next slide. This one also includes a number of little sub-bullets that give us much more detailed instructions about how to document that model usage and development, make sure that we're stating our assumptions and making clear sources of uncertainty and sources of or assumptions that we're making as we go through to help us evaluate these models better. So next slide. If possible, develop methods to calculate a biologically based cap or limit on bycatch of river herring and ocean fisheries. So this one is actually a little unique. Most of the rest of the TORs were based on the Shad benchmark assessment, but this was a specific request from the Mid-Atlantic Council, which does implement a bycatch cap on ocean fisheries in order to try to reduce the overall bycatch of river herring in those fisheries that they manage. However, that cap is currently based on sort of historical levels, and they are very interested in developing a more biologically or scientifically justified cap for those fisheries. So this is also one where we put that in, if possible, in front. We are definitely interested in exploring this. If we could develop this, this would be useful for river herring management from our perspective as well as from the council's perspective, but there's no guarantee that we will actually be able to have the data to do that in a defensible way. We're going to give it a try, but it may or may not pan out. So next slide. So after all of that work, obviously the key finding from the assessment will be to recommend stock status as related to reference points if available. So if we are able to develop reference points for specific stocks, specific rivers, then we will try to recommend stock status relative to those reference points. Next slide. This is sort of a catch-all TOR in terms of other scientific issues that maybe don't fit within a traditional assessment framework, basically focusing on, after we have done all that work, take the time to reflect on, are the answers that we're getting out of this aligning with what our understanding of the stock's dynamics are. So comparing trends in population parameters and reference points with the actual, modeled results coming out afterwards. Compare the reference points that we're developing to what we think we know about the life history of this stock, and consider or explain any inconsistencies, as well as trying to look at, either in a qualitative or a quantitative way, climate change impacts, predation impacts, other anthropogenic sources of mortality on the stock. We may not be able to quantify these effects, but can we describe them in a qualitative framework to help understand what's happening with this species complex. Next slide, please. So our traditional, if a minority report has been filed, make sure that we go through the correct steps of responding to that minority report, and making sure that both reports are in conversation with each other. Next slide. And then sort of the wrap up of number 10, short-term and long-term prioritized research recommendations, as well as recommending the timing of the next benchmark and assessment updates to be most informative to management. So those were the TORs for the stock assessment. Those are the TORs that the SAS will address through our work. Next slide. But we also develop a set of TORs for the peer review panel, and really it's mostly just taking those TORs and then instead of saying do these things, it says evaluate how we did these things. So the TORs for peer review is basically evaluate the choice of stock structure, evaluate the thoroughness of the data collection and the presentation of the data, the treatment of the data, are we fully capturing uncertainty, etc. There's a sort of that similar list of items that they should check off to make sure that we did a good job of presenting. Evaluate the methods and the models used to estimate population parameters, biological reference points, and the bycatch cap limit if we are able to. So if whatever we develop, they will evaluate. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So what I basically just ran through there. Next slide. Again, if a minority report has been filed, we do ask the peer review panel to review that report as well and comment on whether it is an appropriate response, or if basically who's right in this situation, or can you merge them to create sort of a more appropriate response to the minority report and the majority report. And then we'll look to the peer review panel to, after they have reviewed the assessment, to recommend the best estimates of biomass abundance and exploitation, if possible, if we're getting those data out, or specify alternative estimation methods. So if they don't like what we have done and reject it, we would like them to provide an alternative that we can pursue in the future. And then to evaluate the choice of reference points similarly, and the methods used to estimate them, and recommend stock status. So as well as the absolute estimates, recommend stock status, or again, if appropriate, specify an alternative option for management advice. Next slide. And they will also then review the research and data collection recommendations, tell us what they think about our recommendations, and make their own recommendations for future research to improve the reliability of the assessment in the future. They will provide their own opinion on the timing of the next benchmark and stock assessment updates. Next slide. And then prepare their final report, summarizing their evaluation of our assessment. And ideally have that done within 4 weeks of the end of the workshop. So that's it for the TORs. I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't know if we want to just jump straight into the SAS or approve them separately.
Thank you, Katie. I think what we'll do here is just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions from the board for Katie relative to the terms of reference. Mike Armstrong.
Katie, going back to the bycatch TOR, the putative source that everyone believed was a major source was the herring and the mackerel fishery, which are at a very, very diminished level now. And yet, as Justin said, we've had tremendous downturns across age classes, which is suggestive of bycatch because it's not year class strength. Is there any, or will you be looking at what we see is bycatch and small mesh, other fisheries that kind of have been ignored, like whiting and squid? Would it be your intent to dig into those other fisheries and see what you find?
So yes, good question. So obviously there is the mackerel and the herring fisheries have had special dedicated sampling programs for that level of bycatch and monitoring. But there is also the larger Northeast Fisheries Science Center bottom trawl, there is the bottom trawl, but I was thinking specifically of the observer program that covers a wider range of gears and fisheries. However, that is also does have limited coverage, so it's hard to say what the uncertainty will be on those estimates. We will update them for this assessment, and we'll look for other sources of bycatch data if possible, but for sure it's a limitation of the data that we have available to us, that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around that. While that TOR is specifically for a management plan that addresses those two fisheries, I think we can provide more general advice as well. Perhaps we won't be able to say this is the exact level for the cap that the council is interested in, but can we provide advice on bycatch in general to the commission and to the council to address that as a whole based on our data.
Okay, Bill Hyatt.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question you're going to be able to answer at this point, but given all the if possibles and where possibles in what you showed us, and you know, it seems like tour number 8 is going to be kind of an important catch-all to address a lot of this stuff. And I just was wondering if given any thought to how fine-grained relative to specific watersheds and populations you envision getting in this assessment compared to, say, previous assessments?
So I think we would, we want to get as fine-grained as we can given the data. So there will definitely be some systems where we can get very detailed information and possibly even develop estimates of exploitation or estimates of total biomass. There will be other systems where it's like, well, we think we saw a river herring in there once. And so I think the goal is to try to be as detailed as possible spatially, but then build up to more regional within still a biologically based framework to say, okay, this river appears to be or is most likely part of this larger metastock, and what is this overall trends doing for these different rivers, where we can combine data sets from different rivers into still a biologically meaningful trend. So I think it's still hard to say. The goal would certainly would not be to be less detailed than previous assessments. I think the goal would be to maybe, instead of focusing on, so the last time the level between river and coast was state. So if we couldn't, we would talk about specific rivers, and then we talked about the states in general, and then the coast. And I think this time the goal would be, instead of focusing on state as a unit, focus on some of these genetic regional stocks as a unit in between river and coast, if that helps.
Okay, John Maniscalco.
Bill and I had similar questions. Katie, I was just wondering if we've previously been able to utilize environmental data in earlier river herring assessments, and if you think there's a real chance that we could see some analyses on at least some river systems considering environmental impacts. Thanks.
I think we've had some limited information, but it has been more in a qualitative sense of saying, this is what the environment has done compared to this is what the trend has done. I think we're definitely interested in trying some more, especially with related to run counts, to look at more comprehensively at environmental factors that can be driving those run counts, as opposed to just sort of, here's the run count, we're done. I think trying to look at environmental conditions and other factors that could be related to that run count, as well as trying to, I think one of our big questions is, why are we seeing differences in regions? So I think, Southern New England was saying they've seen some of the worst runs in history recently, and other regions have been saying things have looked fine for us. 2022 was great. And so, what is causing that difference? And so is that related to the environment? Is that related to management? Is that related to other factors that we don't have a good handle on yet? So I think for sure we would like to do more with that. But again, the limitation is, do you have that environmental data for the complete time series of that run? Did your methods change halfway through your counting process, et cetera? So I think we're definitely interested in that, and we'll pursue it where possible, given the data limitations that we have.
Okay, I'll go to Lynn Fegley and then John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Katie, for that presentation. So I was curious, you've got a TOR to reflect on additional sources of mortality by stock, and then also the bycatch catch. And I'm just wondering if there's any mechanism to look at how bycatch is affecting a particular stock. So as Mike Armstrong pointed out, there's a sort of putative that bycatch could be impacting the runs in the Northeast, and maybe that's why the Northeast is having issues. Is there a way to tease out bycatch mortality and how it affects a particular stock, or how does that work?
So there has been some limited data collected on the genetic composition of bycatch of fish in the bycatch fisheries. So we do have, but it's more snapshot type of stuff. So we can definitely look at, in recent years there's been data collected on that. So we can definitely then link some of that bycatch back to these genetic stocks, probably not down to the river level, but back to some of these more genetically distinct stocks. But again, that's kind of like a snapshot in time, but it's definitely a step closer to maybe having an understanding of, again, are these differences in condition or run counts, et cetera, coming from something like differential mortality in these bycatch fisheries across different regions is something we're very interested in looking at.
Okay, John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation, Katie. Yet another question on number 8. The item you had about predation just had me curious. We've seen an absolute explosion of invasive catfish in the mid-Atlantic, and we've been doing stomach contents on blue cats. Is there any way to work that type of information into your natural mortality? And then on the other hand, there's a huge amount of money available right now going into fish passage. We have a lot of dams just in a state as small as Delaware that are slated either for removal or putting in natural fish passages to allow herring to get over. Is that something that can be considered in the modeling you do? Thanks.
Yeah, no, good question. So I think I'm not sure that we will be able to quantify the effects of predation in terms of changing your natural mortality at this point. I think we can definitely look at linkages between increasing of invasive species or increases in the striped bass population in certain rivers, and how does that compare to the overall trends in mortality that we're seeing. So I think we can look at it as a factor. It may end up being a little more qualitative than quantitative at this point. In terms of the fish passage question, we are working again with the people who did the Shad habitat model and try to translate that into a river herring model. So hopefully we'll be able to provide some similar information that we did with Shad about sort of the potential benefits of restoration and quantify the effects of habitat loss for river herring. Obviously, it's not a simple port over that the shad habitat is different than the river herring habitat. And so for blueback herring is different than alewife at that level. So we'll need to put in some more work to refine those maps and the habitats for those species, but hopefully we can apply that same approach and provide similar information on that as we did for shad.
Okay, I'll look to the board to see if there are any additional questions on the terms of reference for the stock assessment. Do we have any hands on the webinar at all? Okay, not seeing any additional questions. I think what I'd like to do at this time is ask Dr. Drew to present the stock assessment subcommittee membership, and then after that, we'll entertain motions to approve the terms of reference and the stock assessment subcommittee membership.
Sure, it should be a very quick. Next slide. So I will be presenting the stock assessment subcommittee membership. Next slide. So we have excellent representation from, we have people from NOAA Fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as somebody from the USGS via the University of Maine. Joe Zidlewski was one of the habitat modelers I mentioned before, as well as representation from Maine, Delaware, New York, Massachusetts, South Carolina, Maryland, and ASMFC. So I think it's a great subcommittee. These are the names, and good expertise in terms of river herring biology as well as modeling approaches. So, and they have all been hard at work already in the assumption that you will approve them.
Okay, thanks. And that is certainly quite a collection of talent up there on the slide. So we look forward to all the great work they're going to do. I think at this point, we could entertain a motion from the board to approve both the terms of reference and the stock assessment subcommittee membership in one motion. And I believe staff has a motion like that prepared. So I'll look to the board to see if somebody would like to make that motion. John Clark.
I'd be glad to make that motion, Mr. Chair. Move to approve the stock assessment committee and terms of reference for the 2023 benchmark stock assessment as presented today.
Okay, thank you. I have a motion from John Clark. I think I saw a second from Lynn Fegley. I'll ask the board if there is any discussion on the motion. Oh, Malcolm Rhodes.
Do we need to include accepting the members of the stock assessment subcommittee in this motion? Or should that be a separate one? Or is that in it already?
It should be subcommittee,
Oh, okay.
stock assessment subcommittee. I think you were just thrown off by
Yeah.
Great.
the lack of the sub in there.
Thanks for that, Malcolm. Okay, I'll ask the board if there are any objections to the motion. Seeing none, the motion passes by unanimous consent. Okay, moving right along to our next agenda item, we're going to have a presentation on NOAA's River Herring Habitat Conservation Plan by Ben German and Jonathan Watson. Okay, so Ben and John, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you for the invitation to present an overview to the board on NOAA's River Herring Habitat Conservation Plan. My name is Ben German, and I work in the Habitat and Ecosystem Services Division of NOAA Fisheries in our Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I'm joined today by my colleague, Jonathan Watson, and I'll ask him to introduce himself and do a little mic check here.
Hey, can you hear me now?
I got you.
All right, great. Yeah. Hi, I'm Jonathan Watson, also with NOAA Fisheries in the Habitat and Ecosystem Services Division in the Great Atlantic Region in the Annapolis Field Office. Happy to be here today.
All right, next slide, please. So first, we want to acknowledge the NOAA Office of Habitat Conservation for funding this effort. You can see here the three groups that were responsible for document development. First, we have the core team led by a contractor, which was comprised of Jonathan and myself, as well as the contractor whose time with us has ended. His name was Matt Best, as well as Sean McDermott, who helped out early in plan development and is assisting with the final review. Then we had the working group, which you can see there, which is a primarily internal team to NOAA, where we did have representatives from ASMFC, you can see there. And then we had the steering committee, which was comprised of regional river herring subject matter experts from partner agencies and academia. This is just a brief overview of the folks involved. We'll provide a little more detail on the roles of these groups in a later slide. Next slide, please. So for a bit of background on the effort, back in 2015, as many of you may be aware, the TUG was formed. That's the Technical Expert Working Group to help address the need for river herring conservation and restoration. As a part of the documents produced by that group, there was a number of them, but they were kind of compiled into a plan back in 2015. And the TUG, although it's no longer formally assembled, it's now kind of folded into the River Herring Forum that meets biannually. At that time, the TUG recommended that the work they completed would be updated and expanded as necessary to reflect the contemporary needs and approaches to research and restoration. And so this plan approaches river herring conservation at the coast-wide scale, builds upon that effort, and takes a bit of a broader approach than most watershed plans that you may be familiar with. This allows for a bit of a more inclusive framework. However, it is a little bit less specific likely than some of the regional or local plans by necessity. But it is designed to support these more directed efforts at finer scales. Next slide, please. So here are some of the plan features that seek to improve on past efforts. The 2015 plan was largely retrospective and came on the heels of NIMF's 2013 Endangered Species Act listing determination. River herring were not listed as a result of the 2013 determination or the revisit in 2019. However, it was noted in both cases that the lack of information on the species is a challenge, but more on this later. This plan takes a bit more proactive of an approach, focusing on the needs of river herring over the next decade and beyond. And also it's being produced in a traditional document format, which is a bit easier to navigate and share out compared to the web-based offering of the 2015 plan, which incidentally is no longer public facing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan for some finer details on the contents of the plan. Next slide.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. Yeah, I just wanted, what were our overall goals at the outset of this plan, and essentially, asking the question of how do we conserve and restore these species, which are at historically low abundances coastwide, and really with a focus on their habitat. the goal here was to provide a framework complete with goals and objectives for the restoration of river herring throughout their range in a single document. It's also to facilitate hydropower licensing review, federal EFH and hydropower consultations, and promote restoration projects in support of river herring conservation and management. And this document is, really designed to help NOAA Fisheries meet our mandates in all these avenues. We also want to support coordination and collaboration internally across regions, the Great Atlantic region and the Southeast region of NOAA Fisheries, and also between tribes and state agencies and other partners. And finally, another broad goal is to support collaborative restoration activities by state agencies, tribes, and NGOs and other stakeholders throughout the range of river herring, which is Florida to Maine. So next slide. And how we went about doing this, basically structured the effort by developing 2 different committees. Obviously, the core team that Ben described included Ben and myself and the contractor, Matt Best, as well as Sean McDermott. But then also, with close review from the NOAA internal team and ASMOC representatives, which is about 10 people from the Greater Atlantic region, NOAA Fisheries, the Southeast region, and the Restoration Center. And that working group was really responsible for reviewing and compiling available data, developing the content, producing the draft materials, and providing initial review of the document. And then that steering committee, which was composed of those technical experts throughout the range of river herring, they were responsible for, providing feedback on the plan content and direction, bringing additional regional context to the document, providing secondary review. And we have been through several rounds of review at this point. We are closing in on entering it into the final publication process through our policy series, the Great Atlantic Region Field Office Policy Series, which is anticipated at the end of this year or maybe beginning of next year. All right, next slide. So a lot of text here, not intended to be read, but this is essentially how we structured the plan. Each of these bullets represents a chapter. Aside from the intro to the agencies, which and our missions, which we've already kind of covered here, I'll jump into each one of these sections in a little bit finer detail here. So next slide. So the first 2 chapters of the document focus on, life history and stock status. A lot of this information is already out there, has been presented in various documents, but we work to update, those documents by placing recent studies which add to that body of knowledge within the context of this past literature. We also provide information about the management timeline for recent fisheries management efforts, and condense several decades of fisheries management information into one source document, and divide it up by region. So that section is largely an update. Next slide. And one of our major focuses of the document was to describe the threats to river herring, again, many of which are known, and these include, barriers to migration and lost connectivity, climate change, habitat degradation, at-sea mortality, hybrids and landlocked variants, trophic dynamics, and other interspecific interactions. As I said, many of these were known, but we provide some updated literature examining their likely effects and describe studies that have focused on emerging threats like invasive species, such as blue catfish shown in the lower left there, and climate change, which we are, still learning about. So next slide. In the data gaps and research needs section, many of these were identified in the 2015 plan developed by the Technical Expert Working Group, and they were focused on several categories, including climate change, fisheries and stock status, life history strategies and population dynamics, habitat use and viability, species interactions, and historical population information. Here we just highlight the need for continued research on these species because we're still learning about them. There's still things we don't know. And we also highlight how answering specific research questions would help address emerging threats, for example, climate change, and identify how it would help direct the management of the species. Next slide. Section 6, I believe it is, the ecosystem integration, social ecological benefits section. acknowledges that a healthy, well-functioning riverine system holds intrinsic values that can be measured in economic, social, cultural, and ecosystem services terms. In many systems, river herring are considered a keystone species, and we note that function. And by highlighting each of these benefits, we also note that where the stocks are diminished, restoration provides an opportunity to enhance this suite of functions and really we really work to tie it to the human community benefit. We also drew attention to the important link that river herring provide between marine and freshwater ecosystems, such as marine-derived nutrients, the prey buffering roles that they serve, support of the marine food web as forage, and also co-benefits for other freshwater species such as mussels. And then again, as one of those ways that we work to demonstrate the value for communities of river herring, to human communities, we documented different contemporary river herring festivals up and down the coast. We currently have about 20 different festivals, and most of those are in New England. And we just acknowledge that those festivals can help establish a sense of place and can enhance economic activity in some of our coastal towns. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ben to finish up the plan description.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. So this section tackles a bit of a description of the watersheds that we're looking at here. You can see on the map, we're looking at 24 coastal Huck 4 watersheds from Maine to Florida. This is an area over 300,000 square miles. It gives a very broad overview of river herring management and threats documented in each of these watersheds. And it also attempts to catalog existing plans and assessments, reference those, describing threats and sources of degradation in each specific watershed. Next slide, please. Diving in a little finer scale in this section as well, we have kind of an overview of the 233 Huck 8 watersheds that comprise those 24 Huck 4s that I showed in the previous slide. And we attempt to assign, a designation whether that Huck 8 is a focus area or not for river herring management. And in order to do this, we established 4 criteria. And based on our review to date, the identified focus areas were highlighted here. So you can see in green, it was yes, a focus, and red, not a focus. And the shade indicates how many of the 4 criteria the reviewers indicated that watershed met in their opinion. And those criteria were, number 1, watersheds with greatest river herring potential, which could mean production in total numbers of fish or the importance of that contribution to the region. Number 2 was watersheds in greatest need of river herring restoration, which could result from degraded historical habitat, extirpated runs for one reason or another, invasive species, or lost connectivity. Criteria number 3 was historical or cultural significance of the former runs, which speaks to a regional sense of place, which includes economic impacts. And criteria number 4 was watersheds with ongoing river herring work, which include tribal, federal, state, local, academic, or NGO-run projects. So you can see there the dark green areas are both a yes focus and meet 3 or 4 of these criteria. Generally, we deferred to the highest value indicated for any Huck 8. So if we were multiple reviewers for a single Huck 8 and one said it was a focus and one said it wasn't, we deferred to the yes vote. I also want to point out that this designation is not intended to indicate a priority for projects or watersheds. It's really as a more formal prioritization exercise might. Rather, it's included here in this plan to shed light on areas where river herring restoration is currently occurring, and it is expected to be a focus of the state managers, tribes, and others over the next decade. And this exercise also served to inform the development of the plan itself, providing relevance and context to our goals and objectives for river herring habitat conservation. So you can kind of view this as a bit of a heat map of where work is being done. You can kind of see the Northeast is relatively dark in color compared to the Southeast. But there's certainly more detail on this plan, and we invite you to take a look once it's published if you're interested. Next slide, please. So the next section, section 8, is the goals, objectives, and recommendations. These were developed including some measurable actions for the restoration of river herrings. The recommendations are specific action items that fall under each objective, which serve the broad level goals. They're viewed as generally beneficial, proactive steps to help the species, and they are not intended to be prescriptive or directive. So there are very few instances here of technical guidance. They're more broad recommendations. And they are crafted to strengthen and support regional, watershed, and local restoration efforts. Next slide. So here you can see kind of the 4 very high-level goals, and I'll briefly run through the 4 of these, as well as some relevant objectives, examples of objectives that would fall under each one. So goal 1 is focused on improving connectivity between the ocean habitat and the spawning and rearing habitat in freshwater. So objectives under this goal include developing watershed plans and prioritizations, pursuing barrier removals where possible, advocating for effective fish passage where removal is not feasible. And each of these objectives have action items that stress a watershed approach to connectivity. Goal 2 focuses on figuring out where the valuable spawning and rearing habitats are and working to conserve and restore them. Objectives here include things like assessing the quantity and quality of current and potential habitat, restoring degraded habitats, and minimizing human impacts on river herring and their habitats, pertaining to things like construction, water intakes, etc. Goal 3 is focused on building partnerships that we may collectively work together for the benefit of these species. Objectives here include disseminating information about research and potential funding for project partners, and continuing to convene researchers, managers, and restoration practitioners at the River Herring Forum. Finally, Goal 4 is focused on addressing knowledge gaps. Objectives here include describing how climate change may interact with other threats, such as invasive species, monitoring of runs, and providing reliable and comparable data throughout the range of the species, and defining factors that govern effective upstream and downstream passage at different barriers. And again, there are many sub-bullets to each of these, but these goals and objectives are really aimed to benefit river herring and support efforts of practitioners engaged in restoration at state and local scales. Next slide, please. The final section in the plan is what we've called our Restoration Project Showcase. It provides examples of recent restoration efforts targeted to benefit river herring. We worked with our Restoration Center and other practitioners, including state agencies and NGOs, to develop a comprehensive list of projects that have occurred over the last 5 to 10 years. We came up with a list of 30 plus projects that are included in a table in the appendix of the plan, but we selected 11 of these to highlight in this section, which represent a range of approaches implemented across the range of the species. It's intended to describe some of the successes and lessons learned through the process of implementing these projects, and it's intended to provide some greater insight into how the projects are developed, funded, and challenges to overcome to help inform future efforts. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll just close with some of the intended benefits of the plan. It's really a compendium of material at a coast-wide scale. Again, much of this information is available, but is scattered among various state, watershed, and local planning efforts. And our intent here is to bring them together into a single document. Not to rehash those efforts, but at least to, in some cases, point the reader to relevant documents that they may be interested in. It provides watershed information, management actions and timeline, as well as recommendations for the diversity of habitats that support river herring along the Atlantic coast. And it has a particular relevance to some of the recent federal funding opportunities through the infrastructure law. It also helps with our internal coordination across regions at NOAA Fisheries in our work through whether it's FERC hydropower or non-hydropower engagement. And it also provides the granular detail on restoration projects necessary to help inform future efforts. So with that, I'll wrap up and take questions if there are any. Thank you for your time today.
Okay, I'm being told Jonathan and Ben may not have heard what I just said, so I'll just thank them again for the presentation, and I'm looking to the board to see if there are any questions. Mike Armstrong.
I'm pretty sure I saw it earlier, but I sort of missed it. When will this document become available?
We're hoping to publish by the end of this calendar year, at the very latest, January or February.
I'm lazy and we're busy. If you could provide notification ASMFC, and maybe through James, and he could then notify all of us when it becomes available, that would be awesome.
We'll be sure to do that.
Okay, and James is nodding, so it sounds like that will happen. All right, any other questions from the board? Okay, thank you again, Jonathan and Ben, for that presentation. All right, we'll move on to our last item on the agenda this morning. I'm going to turn to Tina Berger from Commission staff, who has a nomination for the advisory panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I offer for the board's consideration and approval two nominees to the Shad and River Herring Advisory Panel, Paul Pera, a recreational angler, and Jerry Audette, also an angler and outdoor writer. Both are from Massachusetts.
Okay, thank you, Tina. We have a motion up on the board. I'll look to see if there's somebody willing to make that motion. Sheree Patterson. Sheree, would you be willing to read that into the record? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I would love to. It'd be wonderful to see Paul Pera back into this. So move to approve the nominations of Paul Pera and Jerry Audette from Massachusetts to the Shad and River Herring Advisory Panel.
Okay, and I'm seeing a second from Pat Gear down the line there. I'll ask the board if there is any discussion or comments on the motion. Okay, I'll ask if there are any objections to the motion. Seeing none, the motion passes by unanimous consent. Thank you. All right, so we've reached the end of our agenda items. I'll ask if there is any other business to come before this board this morning. Okay, not seeing any takers. I'll again thank Dr. Katie Drew, James Boyle, and Brian Nealon for their help running the meeting this morning. I was also remiss this morning in not acknowledging Madeline Masante and Dustin Colson leaning down there at the end of the table, who are helping keeping the magic board going this morning. Thanks very much for your help with that. And I'll take a quick moment just to congratulate Dustin. Dustin's going to be leaving the commission, I believe, next week for a new position with Environmental Defense Fund. I've had the good fortune of working closely with Dustin in my capacity as the chair of the Summer Flounder Scup and Black Sea Bass Management Board, and Dustin's been excellent to work with. I'm sure he'll be an asset to his new organization he's moving on to. So thank you, Dustin, and congratulations and good luck.